Welcome to our channel, The World of Ghosts and Demons. If this is your first visit, hello, I am Dui Thuan, the owner of this place. Please come in, I will take you to stories full of spiritual horror. What will today's story be about? How will the story unfold? Please listen to it right away. Phong Trac Village is located near the sea. Summer is hot, autumn is stormy, winter is freezing cold. Although the rain is not favorable, the people's lives are somewhat difficult, but thanks to the sea, food is always available. Stepping into Phong Trac Village, it is very simple to know which house is rich and which is poor. The closer the house is to the coast, the poorer it is, and the closer the house is to the mainland, the better off it is. Because only poor families who do not have money to buy and rent land have to build temporary houses near the coast to live, because sandy land is inherently unsuitable for growing crops and raising livestock. Cooked rice must be covered tightly, because if just one gust of wind blows by, you will end up eating rice with sand in it. The whole village has about 30 households living in small clusters. The poor live near the poor, the rich live near the rich. The wind of each level interacts with the clouds of that level. The richest house here is the house of Old Paul, a landlord with a lot of land and money. Like tens of thousands of other landlords in the world, Old Paul is also a bad guy, rich but arrogant, rich but stingy, rich but with a rotten personality. He always collects land taxes at exorbitant prices. When Flora has a good harvest, it is bearable. When Flora has a continuous storm and crop failure, the people do not have money to pay taxes, so he confiscates all the cows to pay the debt. Even though they are bullied like that, few people dare to oppose, because in this area, Old Paul owns the most land, and it is all good land. People are afraid of being chased off the land by him, so the only option is to move to the coast to live. Although living near the sea, most of the villagers have long since given up their salt making and fishing jobs. The reason is because the weather is too harsh, working harder than farmers, but only earning a few coins. So gradually, people switch to renting land from landlords to cultivate. The way of life is cruel. The rich eat off the poor are poor forever and can't raise their heads. But there is still someone even poorer than the poor. That is Nick, the son of Mrs. Flora Mango Geo. The poor mother and son built a thatched house right next to the seashore and lived a miserable life. I heard that Mrs. Flora Mango was a foreigner who had wandered to Phong Trac Village. She was a woman who had no husband and could not support herself to give birth to Nick. The story of being pregnant without a husband has always been considered a disgrace. That is why Mrs. Flora Mango left her hometown to seek a living, having no relatives, only the mother and son relying on each other, so the house was very lonely. That Nick Flora had just turned 20 years old. He was much taller and stronger than his peers. Thanks to pulling the net, his muscles were bulging. His skin was as firm and strong as a water buffalo. Every day, Nick and his mother would go to the sea to pull the net to make a living. Nick was also one of the last people in the village who still kept the profession of his ancestors. Except for poverty and hardship, Nick was gentle, hard-working, and famous for being very filial. He was the kind of person who gave way to children and respected the elderly, never cared to gossip or pry into village affairs. He looked so big, but he was very timid and gullible. All day long, people tricked him into taking fish without paying. Because he was so gentle, he became a bit naive. The villagers often teased Nick that he was the kind of person with the body of a tiger, but the heart of a mouse. Everything was fine until one day, Mrs. Flora Mango suddenly fell seriously ill. The doctor said that because of overwork, she had contracted the white plague, which is today's tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was an infectious disease. At that time, anyone who had this disease would be shunned. No one dared to come near for fear of catching the disease. Once infected, the only thing left was to lie there and wait to die. Even if there was a warehouse full of silver and gold, there was no way to save her. Nick loved Mrs. Flora Mango and did not want his mother to die, so he went to Mr. Paul's house to borrow money to buy medicine to save his mother. In the past, very few people in the village dared to borrow money from Mr. Paul because he charged exorbitant interest. No one had ever been able to pay back both principal and interest. In the end, they were all forced to become servants working for free for his family. Mr. Paul had already had his eye on Nick for a long time. He was tall and strong, and his strength alone was sometimes 2 or 3 times that of an ordinary person. When Nick came to the door to borrow money, Paul was just waiting for that moment. There had never been a business deal in his life where he had to lose. Knowing Nick's honest and gentle nature, he showed concern and lent him a string of coins. Nick took the money and quickly left without even asking about the interest. Nick just brought the money and ran straight to the market to buy some medicine and some pork to nourish his mother, not daring to eat any meat but saving it all for his mother. When Mrs. Flora asked, he lied that he was full. In her entire life, Mrs. Flora Mango had eaten red meat only a handful of times. For the past 10 years, Flora had only eaten dried fish. Only when she was near death could she stuff a few pieces of meat into her mouth. After more than a week of treatment, Mrs. Flora Mango's health could not cope with the terrible disease, so she breathed her last and passed away. Nick was extremely saddened by his mother's passing. From now on, he was the only one left in this world. The poor family did not have even 2 meters of decent land to make a final resting place for his mother. So Nick cremated Mrs. Flora Mango's body and taught her to throw her ashes into the sea. When everyone in the village heard that Mrs. Flora Mango had died, they all sighed and exclaimed. It was true that looking up, they were not as good as anyone, but looking down, no one was as good as them. Indeed, the misery Nick had gone through was only the beginning. Endless suffering was still waiting for him ahead. Mrs. Flora had just died more than 30 days when old Paul brought people to collect the debt. For the past 2 months, Nick had been taking care of his sick mother and taking care of the funeral, so he had no energy to think about earning money. He asked old Paul to give him more time, but it was not that easy. The old man insisted on asking for both the principal and interest. At first, the old man had only lent Nick a string of coins, but after only 2 months, he asked for 10 times the amount, with an interest rate that was unprecedented. He said, "That day, you came to my house to borrow money, and we didn't even have time to make any agreement before you ran away. Then I have to decide for myself. You've already spent all my money. Now it's useless to report to the authorities, my child. But since my birth, I have never seen a family as poor and dilapidated as yours, even poorer than a beggar, with nothing to collect the debt. Well, since you can't pay the debt, you have to work for my family for free for 5 flora." Old Paul is so miserable, he made up the deal himself, but clearly he didn't say a word that day. He just told Nick to come home early to take care of his old mother, but now he's being so rude, cheating and lying, and he even made Nick work for 5 floras for free. Everyone knows that Nick's strength alone is equal to 2 normal people. Those 10 strings of coins, if converted into work, would only be equal to 1 flora's work. It's really too much bullying, and the villagers are all indignant, but they can't help Nick at all. There's no evidence or witnesses. Just like he said, even if he reported it to the authorities, it would be useless. Not to mention that the old officials above him are also close friends with old Paul. He wants a good place to launder money, but those corrupt officials want his money for the common good and take advantage of each other. The common people, the weak and powerless, are oppressed and have to endure it. It's hard to live in peace when they rise up. Unfortunately, he met Nick, a gentle and shy boy. Although he resisted, it was not significant. In the end, Nick still had to follow Paul to work as a servant for his family to pay off his debt. From here, Nick stepped out of this sea of suffering and plunged into another sea of suffering without a single day of peace. After returning home, old Paul said that he was just a servant, but in fact, he assigned Nick to do all the heavy farm work, making full use of his labor. In just the first month of observation, as old Paul had assessed, Nick worked very productively and carefully, neatly and orderly. Moreover, because his circumstances were poor since birth, although he was tall and strong, his appetite was not worth mentioning. He was strong, broad-shouldered, and didn't spend much on food. Even if he searched the whole village, he still couldn't find a second person like him. Before, old Paul had only intended to force him to work for free for 5 flora, but now that he saw that he brought more benefits than expected, he came up with a plan to make him work for him for the rest of his life. Anyway, Nick is just a big guy, but has a bad brain and is easily fooled, so this is not too difficult. On the surface, Nick always criticized everything Paul did, showing that he was not satisfied, but in fact, in his heart, he had already drawn up a plan to lure the naive deer into his trap. During the first 2 years Flora worked for Paul, Nick was very popular with everyone. His job was the hardest, but he never complained. He helped anyone who asked him to. The fate of a sick and weak servant was that he never had a chance to rest. He had to finish his work. Every day, Nick always cared about the people around him. When he noticed someone was sick, he would volunteer to do the work so that they could go home early. That's why everyone loved him, especially Clara, Paul's youngest daughter. Clara Flora was about to turn 18, the most beautiful age in a girl's life. When she reached the age of marriage, Clara began to have her first feelings for the opposite sex, and that person was none other than Nick. The whole family of Paul was the same rotten. Only Clara was beautiful in both appearance and character. Born into a wealthy and aristocratic family, Clara was the matchmaker of many rich young men in the area. Many matchmakers came to the house to ask for Clara's hand in marriage to the young men of the rich families, but the arrogant Paul still refused to accept any of them. He thought they were not worthy. Paul had a total of Flora children, all of whom were boys. Only Clara was a girl, so she was very pampered. But he never expected that his precious daughter would secretly love a poor servant. Anyone who saw it would know that Clara had feelings for Nick, but Nick himself was completely unaware of it. Until one day, Clara received a letter, opened it, and found out that the sender was Nick. The letter contained a love confession, and also an appointment to meet Clara at 12 midnight at a small lake area quite far from Paul's house, a deserted place with not many houses living there, a suitable place to meet. At that time, Clara was very happy because her lover finally confessed. On the appointed day and time, Clara dressed up and put on makeup, then secretly opened the back door and sneaked out to the meeting place. When she arrived at the place, in the distance, Clara saw a figure waiting. The night was long and dreamy. What happened next, only God knows. Until the next morning, the whole family of old Paul was in an uproar over the news of Clara's disappearance. Old Paul mobilized all the servants in the house to look for her, but there was no trace. Until the evening of the same day, there was another news that shocked the whole Phong Truc village: Clara's death. The story was that 2 people who went fishing discovered Clara's body hidden in a banana bush near a small lake. The body was bruised, her hair was disheveled, her clothes were tattered, and she was almost naked. At first glance, it was clear that she had been humiliated before she died. When she heard that her daughter had died, old Paul's wife, Doan, fainted on the spot. Old Paul was furious and sent someone to report to the authorities, then posted a notice that whoever caught the murderer of Clara would be given a piece of good land and 10 taels of pure gold. The news spread, and the whole village was in an uproar. A good plot of land and 10 tiles of pure gold could change the fate of an entire family. Just 1 plot of land was enough to make a living for a lifetime. So everyone in the family rushed to find the culprit, including the servants in Paul's house. After only about 3 days, the owner of the prize was found. It was Iris, Clara's close servant. She found a letter in Clara's room and pointed out that Nick was the culprit. The entire content of the letter was undeniable evidence. The meeting place matched the location where Clara's body was found. and the letter was signed by Nick. Knowing the truth, everyone was shocked and could not believe that a fox like Nick could do such a beastly thing. As for Nick, before he could even open his mouth to say anything, Paul had someone beat him up. Nearly 10 people, including Paul and Daisy, took turns to torture and beat Nick. Paul was furious and poked Nick in the eye with a baton, causing blood to splatter. While beating him, he cursed, "You motherfucker, I'm really blind. Raising a bee in my sleeve, raising a dog to spy on my house. But I lent you money. I raised you to eat 2 Floras, and you dare to kill my daughter. You can't even breathe dog breath to give my daughter her life. I'll kill you. I'll kill you. You guys don't hit him. Hit him for me. Don't stop. Hit him until he dies." With the last of his strength, Nick tried to say, "It's not me, sir. I can't read." He was devastated by the loss, but people standing nearby could hear him. People ran to report to the authorities and spoke up for Nick. "Don't hit him anymore, sir. If he dies, you'll be charged with murder. He said he can't read, sir. Let the authorities come down and judge." But old Paul didn't listen to any of it. Because of his hatred, he assumed that the culprit was Nick, who was just lying to cover up his crime. By the time the authorities arrived, Nick had been beaten to the point of fainting. Then Nick was arrested. He thought that escaping from old Paul and Daisy would save his life, but unexpectedly, old Paul bribed the authorities to force Nick to confess. He was tortured by the soldiers and imprisoned for nearly a month, living a life worse than death. At first, he tried to resist, but later he couldn't stand the torture. So Nick wrote down his fingerprints and confessed, and was finally poisoned to death by old Paul. Nick had no relatives, so no one buried him, and his body was thrown into the sea to be eaten by fish. The story of Nick's death in prison became a hot topic of discussion throughout Phong Trac village. Some people said, "Don't judge a book by its cover." Nick looked so gentle that he was just pretending, but in reality, he was a beast. Some people also said that Nick was wrongly murdered. It was hard to tell whether it was true or false. People kept talking about it until they got bored, and later, the incident was gradually forgotten over time, and Phong Trac village returned to its peaceful life. However, before the storm came, the weather was usually very nice, until Flora, after which mysterious spiritual phenomena began to appear. The first phenomenon occurred in the small lake area, which was also the place where Clara died. Night fishermen said that they often saw a girl dressed in revealing clothes, but only men could see her. Women could not see her at all. People rumored that the girl was a ghost, not a human. She would seduce lustful men and then hide her. The first victim was Old Ko. This old man Flora was nearly 50 years old and had a reputation for being a pervert. That night, he went fishing, and while he was putting bait on the hook, he suddenly heard someone calling, "Mr. Ko, are you fishing alone today?" Hearing the young girl's voice, his eyes lit up. He turned around and saw a young girl with disheveled clothes that showed her breasts. This girl was standing a few dozen steps away from Mr. Stork. Although it was dark and he couldn't see her face clearly, with his professional eye for girls, he knew at a glance that she was beautiful. She was beautiful and dressed like that, actively inviting her. Only a fool would not eat. He threw his fishing rod aside, dusted off the ground, then stood up and walked towards the girl. But for some reason, the closer he got, the further away the girl retreated. At that time, Mr. Stork thought that the girl was embarrassed and ran away, so he chased after her until he put his hand on her shoulder. The moment she turned around, Mr. Stork was so scared that he peed his pants and fainted on the spot, because that face was that of Miss Clara, Mr. Paul's dead daughter. Until the next morning, the old Stork's wife saw that he did not return home all night, so she went to look for him, but after searching for 2 consecutive days, there was still no trace. At this time, the villagers suspected that the old Stork was being hidden by a ghost, so they advised his wife to invite a priest to perform a ritual, and it was true that the old stork was being hidden by a ghost. They found him in a banana bush, right at the place where Clara's body was found. When they pulled the old stork out, he was shaking all over his mouth. That battle, the old stork was sick for a whole week. After he woke up, he told the villagers about being teased by Clara's ghost. After hearing that, everyone was scared. It must be because Clara died young and was an unmarried virgin, so she was so sacred. It was also because some bad men got horny when they saw a beautiful girl and offended her, so they were punished. After Mr. Coe, there were a few other victims who were also hidden and blindfolded by Miss Clara so that they could not be found. The villagers were so scared that no one dared to come near the lake area anymore. The matter reached Mr. Paul, who invited many monks to chant sutras and lead Miss Clara's spirit to the temple to practice. After that, no one saw Miss Clara's spirit appear to tease this person or that person anymore. They thought that was the end of the matter, but no, the real disaster had just begun. That day, it was Craig's turn to guard the main gate of Paul's house. Because he was rich and afraid of thieves, every night he had his servants guard the gate. Around 1 or 2 a.m., Craig was sleeping soundly when he suddenly heard a loud knocking on the door, followed by an urgent voice calling, "Hey! Open the door, and let me in." Craig yawned when he heard a familiar voice. Although he didn't know who it was, he guessed it was probably some beautiful girl in his house. She grimaced and said, "Wait a minute, don't knock on the door. If I wake up, I'll beat you up." As he spoke, Craig unlatched the door and opened it, but strangely, there was no one there. He stood and looked around to see if anyone was teasing him, but after a while, no one appeared. So Craig closed the door and thought to himself that he must have misheard in his sleep. Little did he know that he had just opened the door and let a ghost into the house. That very night, Paul had a dream. In his dream, he saw himself standing on the beach, and in front of him was the wet corpse of Nick, lying face down in the sea. As soon as he saw Nick, he went crazy again. He rushed over and kicked the corpse a few times to relieve his anger. While kicking, he cursed, "Even if you were dead, I would still find it annoying, damn Craigo." At that moment, in his soul, he realized that what he saw was when Nick had just died and was thrown into the sea by the soldiers. While he was trying to vent his anger, Nick's body suddenly shook, and suddenly his hand grabbed Paul's ankle and jerked it, causing him to lose his balance and fall backwards. While he had not yet recovered, Nick's body suddenly jumped up and jumped on Paul and strangled him. At a close distance, Paul could clearly see Nick's face. Before, he had poked a baton into one of his eyes. Now, right there, the eye was nowhere to be seen. Only the black, empty eye socket remained. His entire face, limbs, and flesh were mangled as if something had gouged and pecked at his flesh. Nick strangled his neck so hard that Paul stuck out his tongue and could not breathe. He struggled to resist until he was able to escape, which was also the moment he woke up. He hugged his neck and gasped for breath. Even though it was just a dream, the very real feeling in my neck still transmitted a sharp pain. Just as he regained his composure, he suddenly heard Daisy mumbling. He turned around and saw her foaming at the mouth. He hurriedly shook his wife awake, but Daisy's whole body was stiff, and he kept calling her, but she wouldn't wake up. So Paul slapped his wife hard on the face a few times before she woke up. As soon as she woke up, Daisy rushed over and hugged Paul stiffly, looking around with a pale face. She said, dear, that Nick strangled me, dear. I just had a dream about him." Just now, old Paul thought he was having a nightmare, but now Daisy also said that Nick was strangling him. The old couple sat down and told each other their dreams and were shocked to discover that they had the exact same dream. Then, for 3 consecutive nights, every night, the old couple dreamed of being strangled by Nick. This definitely couldn't be a coincidence. Old Paul was a big businessman. Most of the rich people who made a lot of money from trading were very spiritual, and he was no exception. Before, every time he had a piece of land, old Paul would ask a feng shui master to come and see the terrain before buying it. The recent events made old Paul uneasy. Those who do bad things always have ghosts in their hearts. He was afraid that Nick's spirit would cause trouble, so he immediately invited a feng shui master to come and see what the situation was. But unfortunately for him, the feng shui master was a fake master. He was just a parasite that sucked the blood of his host, Paul. This time, the feng shui master was the one who got the bait. He pretended to make a quick offering and then said a few random words that everything was fine and that everything would be fine, then took the money and left. Paul thought that he had finished his work and didn't have to worry anymore. But what happened next made his whole family miserable and unable to handle it. Late that night, Iris, Clara's close maid, was in the kitchen picking up leftovers when suddenly a voice from behind said, "Iris, mother, give me something to eat. I'm so hungry." Iris thought that some of the servants were hungry and went to the kitchen to pick up food like her. But in the pot, there was only a little cold rice mixed with potatoes, not enough to eat. She didn't even bother to turn around to see who it was. She just grimaced and replied, "It's all gone. There's nothing left for mother to eat. This portion is mine." At this time, there was no answer, nor any sound of footsteps leaving. Feeling strange, Iris turned her back to look. At that moment, she panicked and jumped back into the kitchen, causing a pile of pots and pans to fall to the ground. Because Nick was standing right behind Iris, only 6 steps away from Flora. Nick's spirit smiled and said, "I'm back, Iris. Mom, eat. Eat everything. When you're full, pay me back." Iris was so scared that she fainted on the spot. That night, Craig was also harassed by Nick's spirit. This guy was a scoundrel. He specialized in seducing the servants in Paul's house. Whoever was gullible would be seduced and eaten clean. There was a girl who slept with Craig and accidentally got pregnant, but Craig denied responsibility and forced her to have an abortion, almost dying. That story was known to all the servants in the house. That night, Craig slept with Daisy's maid. After doing it, he put his clothes back on and left. On the way back, someone suddenly threw a rock at him and hit him right in the head. He angrily shouted, "That fucking Craig, your fucking head is broken. Come out here." But in response, a hailstorm of wet stones pelted him, with a faint smell of salt and fish. Craig reflexively hid behind a large tree to avoid the hailstorm while looking around to see who threw the stones at him, until he accidentally looked up at the branch of the jam tree. He was so scared that he peed his pants because Nick was standing there. Nick laughed loudly and said in a shrill voice, "It's me. I'm Nick. I'm throwing rocks at you. What can you do to me? What can you do to me?" At that moment, Craig's legs were shaking. He wanted to run away, but perhaps because he was too scared, he could only take a few small steps and then knelt down on the ground, prostrating and saying, "It's not me. It's not me. No, it's Iris. Iris harmed you. I don't know. I don't know. Injustice has a cause and a cause. Don't look for me. Don't look for me." As soon as Craig finished speaking, Nick's ghost jumped down right where Craig was standing, shook its head, stared at him, and said, "I'm dead. Stupid. I'm a ghost. I know everything. You, and Iris. I won't spare anyone. Go to hell and atone for your sins." The next morning, the servants found Iris unconscious in the kitchen and Craig lying unconscious in the backyard with a mouthful of dirt in his mouth. Iris was fine until noon when she woke up, but Craig lay there for 2 days before he woke up. When he woke up, he was very panicked. His whole body was shaking. His hands were covering his eyes. When asked anything, he didn't say anything. From that day on, Craig's mind was no longer like a normal person's. He quit his job and hid in the storage room all day, covered himself with a blanket, and occasionally shouted, "Someone, save me. Nick killed me. Save me. Save me! At first, everyone thought something was wrong with Craig, so they ran to see him, but they only saw him crying and screaming for help while no one did anything to him. They thought Craig was crazy, so eventually no one paid any attention to him anymore. Because Craig was a scoundrel, Paul didn't feed him. He said he didn't keep useless things in the house. If you work, you'll have food. If you don't work, you'll starve. No one knew what happened to Craig, because after just one night, he suddenly became crazy, and his mind was not clear. Only Iris knew what happened, because she never had a peaceful night. Nick's spirit kept haunting her and wouldn't let her go. Even though she was tortured like that, Iris didn't dare tell anyone, because she was afraid that the shocking secret would be revealed, and this secret was only known to her and Craig. This was also the reason why Nick wanted to find the two of them to collect the debt. Less than a month later, Craig died an unnatural death. That day, the house was strangely quiet because Craig had been screaming and yelling every day before, but today there was no movement all day. Although Paul did not feed Craig, the servants in the house felt sorry for him, so they each gave him a little food to eat. That evening, Iris brought in some boiled cassava for Craig. At that time, Craig was lying with his back to the wall, as if he was sleeping. Iris called him over and over again, but he did not move until she touched Craig and discovered that he had been stiff and dead for a long time. Craig died with his eyes open. One of his eyes fell out of his socket and rolled around on the bed, and on his fingertips there were dried bloodstains. He must have gouged out his own eyes. Seeing that scene, Iris screamed loudly, and then opened the door and ran out. The servants in the house did not know what was going on, so they gathered around to see, and only then did they realize that Craig had died. Having someone die in the house was a big deal, so it alarmed Paul and Daisy. Paul ordered someone to capture Iris to question her because she was the first person to discover Craig's death. When Iris was brought in, her hands and feet were shaking and her whole body was covered in cold sweat. Before Paul could even open his mouth to say anything, Iris was already crying and kneeling down, begging, "Please, please, please, save me. Nick killed C, and he will kill me too. I don't want to die. I don't want to die." As soon as he heard Nick's name mentioned, old Paul got angry and kicked Iris when she fell to the ground. Old Paul shouted, "Shut up. Nick is dead. You hear me? Don't mention him again. Whoever mentions him again, I'll beat them to a pulp." Even though Iris was threatened, she still tried to struggle and screamed in protest. "No, it was Nick. I saw his ghost with my own eyes. Nick died unjustly. You killed him, and he will kill you too. You should think of a way." Hearing Iris say this, everyone was surprised, including old Paul and old Daisy. The truth was only now revealed through Iris's testimony. Actually, the letter that Clara received was not from Nick because Nick was really illiterate. The person who impersonated Nick was Craig, who plotted to take away the mistress's virginity. As long as Craig threatened old Paul with the humiliation of Clara, he would definitely marry Clara to him. If she refused to marry him, he would spread the news throughout Fong Trak village that Clara had been humiliated by him. At that time, no matter how much money they had, no family would dare to take Clara through the main gate as their daughter-in-law. The mastermind behind this was not only Craig, but also Iris, because the two of them were siblings, and Iris was Clara's close servant, so the whole plot was carried out very easily. It was Iris who secretly put the letter in Clara's room for her to read, then waited for her to leave the room to go to the meeting place, and Iris hid the letter to avoid being exposed. But one thing went beyond their plan, which was that Clara died while being raped by Craig. Because she was so humiliated, Clara bit her tongue and committed suicide. The story of Clara's death was exposed, and the authorities and Paul sent people everywhere to search for the culprit. At that time, Iris and Craig were very afraid of being caught, but when Paul announced a big reward for anyone who found the culprit, their greed arose again, and they took advantage of the fake letter to frame Nick, which eventually led to Nick's unjust death. After learning the truth, Paul was so scared that his legs were shaking. He ordered someone to capture Iris and hand her over to the authorities for handling, remembering the scene of Craig's eye being gouged out, just like when he saw Nick in his dream, plus Iris saying that Paul was afraid Nick would take revenge on him. He and his wife immediately sought out the monks he had invited before to lead Clara's spirit to the temple. Perhaps God did not want him to escape, so this time the monks refused to help him, saying, "It was not fate, we could not help." Old Paul and Mrs. Daisy had no choice but to leave. Just as they got home, and had not yet had time to catch their breath, another bad news came, that Iris had died. Before the soldiers could question them, Iris suddenly went crazy and banged her head against the wall to commit suicide. After hearing the news, old Paul wet his pants. So Nick's spirit was truly taking revenge. The death of the two people who had framed him was undeniable evidence. For the next few days, Daisy and Paul were so scared that they didn't dare to step out of their room. They went to the toilet and urinated in the chamber pot and asked the servants to empty it. They also bathed in their room. At night, they lit candles until dawn, only daring to sleep during the day and not at night. Until one afternoon, while Paul and Daisy were sleeping, they suddenly heard a knock on the door. Daisy frowned and said, "Who is it? What's the matter that you're knocking so loudly? Don't you let anyone sleep?" There was no answer, but the knocking continued steadily. This alarmed old Paul, who shouted, "Damn it, you're so noisy! Come in!" The knocking stopped abruptly, and the door flew open. Paul and Daisy both froze on the spot when they saw Nick standing there, his ghost in broad daylight, exactly as he had seen him in their dream. He laughed and said in a booming voice, "Sir, ma'am, I'm home." Old Paul only had time to shout, "You!" After saying that, his whole body became stiff and unable to move. Daisy was the same. Because she was so scared, Daisy cried so much that her tears kept flowing, wetting her shirt, and old Paul peed his pants uncontrollably. I thought I was done for, that I couldn't save my life this time, but Nick's spirit didn't come near. He just stood outside the door and growled, "You guys want to escape? It's not that easy. I would have killed you guys like Iris and Craig, but because you guys are Clara's parents and I love her, I'll spare your lives. From now on, you guys should live in poverty like beggars to pay for your karma." As soon as Nick finished saying that, Paul and Daisy woke up with a start. It turned out to be another dream, but Paul's pants were still wet, and Clara was covered in tears and snot. From that day on, the couple vowed to be vegetarians and not dare to kill, but perhaps their mouths were vegetarians, but their hearts were not sincere, so it had no effect. A few dozen days later, Paul's house suddenly caught fire. The fire burned all of their property and money, including land ownership documents. Paul came to claim the land, but no one wanted to return it because there was no evidence to prove that the land was his property anymore. It had all been taken by the people. With no money, they were so hungry that they had to work to have something to eat. But Paul and his wife had lived immorally and bullied many people before, so no one wanted to help them. Even when they asked for a job, they were chased away. Just as Nick said, in less than a year, old Paul and old Daisy had to beg and live in poverty and misery until they died. In this life, there are two things that cannot be chosen. The first is parents, the second is homeland, the rest can be chosen. Nick is the same. He is aware of his low status, so he chooses to act stupid to live a peaceful life. Nick knows that Miss Clara likes him, and so does he. He loves Miss Clara, but he does not dare to move forward. He knows that he is not worthy of his mistress and does not want her to suffer because of him. But unexpectedly, everything turned into a painful tragedy, and that is also the end of today's story. Thank you all for listening and following. If you have any thoughts or feelings about this story, please leave a comment. And thank you very much to the author for sending such a great story. I wish you all a good night's sleep.